a couple of the points that you kind of asked about, one of them certainly is this a high priority? It's been a very high priority for me and our church for many, many years. The Christian churches since the late 1700s were the ones who were most, in fact, welcoming to immigrants and helped immigrants get established. And when immigrants were in those barrios, in those enclaves, whether they be Irish or Polish or German or wherever, it was really our Christian churches that were the ones who reached out to them, and not only in service, but in advocacy. And so over the years, I've been very proud of our Christian churches and our continuing advocacy. What has happened, we have very broken laws, but it's kind of a parallel. There's another movement which I'm very involved in right now. In 1935, when the Wagner Act was passed, which established the National Labor Relations Act and Board, and began the opportunity for unionization, that act, 1935, specifically excluded two groups of people: farm workers and domestic workers. And those two exclusions were put in primarily to keep the majority of African American domestic workers out of the possibility of unions, and the farm workers who were both African American and Hispanic. Those two exclusions are still in that act. 74 years later, both of those groups are excluded from coverage under the NLRA. And so as a side part of that, if our evolving immigration history and how we treat people, that's one of the points. It was 1929, believe it or not, is the first year this country really enacted any kind of immigration reform legislation at all. This is after the 1700s. It took till 1929, and 35 then developed with the Wagner Act, but still excludes two groups of people, large groups of people who do essential work in our country. So I'm kind of trailing off the course here a bit, but it's a very important part of it. One of the reasons that we are adamant in the Catholic Church today about a focus on this issue is that our country, our government leaders keep messing it up. Back in 1986, they passed, referred to as shorthand, IRCA, the Immigration Reform Control Act, was passed in 1986, and it allowed for a period of amnesty for undocumented people who could prove they were here for at least 5 years, etc. We at the time, our church and other church leaders, kept telling Congress, but you're not fixing the problem. You're only dealing with a group who happen to be here for a certain period of time. You are not fixing the law and making it a system through which people can migrate in and out for necessary work in a legal way. And they said, we'll get around to it later. Well, it's 2009, and we're still just not getting around to it. Although I have a greater hope now than I ever did before that we're going to get to it now. But the result of doing nothing in 1986 about a comprehensive reform and a system of regulating the flow of workers and immigrants has resulted in now at least 12 million people living in the shadows. So it is a very high priority for us. Part of our tradition in this country is that religion, churches, our beliefs, our scriptural, theologically based beliefs have always been seen as having a positive influence on the ethics and the morality of society. And while we have separation of church and state, that doesn't mean that the values and the principles which we believe in terms of our faith dimension cannot be seen and implemented in our governmental societal policies. That's always been happening. What has happened, what I think we have to continue to do, and that's why I started this, my discussion about the very nature of the term economy. See, if we begin economy, that oikonomia, that approach, if we begin that approach about the person and the household of persons, rather than monetary origins, that gets us inside the door where we need to be. It gets us the principle that we need, because then the focus is on the individual person. The person doesn't exist for the economy exists for the person. And that's where our role is. That is to keep that alive and to keep that concept alive. And in particularly in an issue such as immigration, I think that we have a lot to offer our nation, because people can relate to our theological discussion or understanding based on the value of the human person. That is part of it that they get. In fact, the anti-Negro laws, the anti-equality laws, all the laws that have subsequently been overturned and changed, all were based on the wrong premise. They were not based on the premise of the dignity of the person, or they could never have been passed. Equal education rights and equal racial rights, all those things were never passed with a theological underpinning of the dignity of the person, or they would have never been passed. They have subsequently either been overturned by courts or by our Congresses or our legislatures, because I think we've had an influence in recognizing this and dealing with it. I'd have to say some of the unseemly chapters in Roman Catholic history, not as much in this country, but certainly in Europe and other places, it didn't help us, because we were doing the same thing everybody else was doing in terms of how people were treated. In fact, the time of slavery here in this country, we had some bishops, Catholic bishops, who actually had slaves, owned slaves, bought and sold slaves. So, you know, we don't come to this with totally clean hands at all. But we've had to learn, how did that happen? Well, because the emphasis and focus on the value and dignity of the individual person got derailed, and other values took over. Our role, I think, today is to bring those values back to the table, the discussion, the dialogue.